Doing research is questioning and disagreeing. I'm Mayla Boguslav and I study research. I ask questions such as, what is research? How do we measure its success? I live by the motto, ignorance is bliss, because when you don't know something, it's an opportunity to learn. Researchers live in the ignorance or the unknowns. They ask questions, identify areas of ignorance, lead the way to gain knowledge, and most importantly, ask the next questions about our new ignorances. Welcome to the Ignorance Podcast, where we learn about research through research questions. Let's welcome our guest researcher for today. Please introduce yourself by name only and your favorite thing to do outside of work.
Great. My name is David Brandman, and one of my favorite things to do outside of work is play with my 4-year-old son.
Is there something specific you love to play with him, like a game or go outside?
Yeah, I mean, Charlie's a lot of fun. Right now he's really into figurines and he's really into cars, and so we make fun making up stories for that.
Nice. Playing with kids in general is really fun. I teach Hebrew school to kindergartners and first graders, and I love getting out of my normal research brain and getting to hang out with 5 and 6-year-olds is great. The first question, what questions excite you in your work? What questions are you currently pursuing?
The fundamental question I'm trying to ask is to understand how the brain works and to use those insights to help people living with paralysis.
Okay. Why do you do that? Why does that excite you?
Yeah, so I'm a neurosurgeon, and I meet people all the time who live with paralysis. And right now, the state of clinical medicine is that we can't often restore function to people who have disability. A lot of what we do as doctors focuses on stopping things from getting worse or helping people recover with a new normal. And what I'm really excited about is not just focusing on a new normal, but helping to restore function to where they were before an injury, or at least towards where they were before an injury.
Got it. Can you give an example?
Sure. So one example is that I meet people who want to talk but can't. People that live with neurological disease where they have no problem understanding language, they have no problem formulating what they want to say, but the mechanics of coordinating their mouth movements, their tongue movements, their facial expressions aren't working because of their disease.
So how do you hope to impact the world with that question?
So my goal is to help people that live with disease where they want to interact with their environment they can't. And the way I hope to impact that is by using neurotechnology, specifically devices that are designed to record brain signals and then translate those brain signals to empower people to interact with their environment. So let me tell you about Casey, and I can share his name because he's chosen to go public about this. And Casey's a man with ALS. He wants to talk but can't, or at least when he tries to speak, it's very difficult to understand him. There's really a handful of people in the world that can understand him when he speaks. He's paralyzed. He can't move his arms and his legs. And despite this, he's with it. He's a highly intelligent man who has many things to say. And so in 2023, I surgically implanted electrodes into Casey's brain, into part of the brain that helps coordinate speech, the so-called motor cortex, the part of the brain that helps coordinate the muscle activity of the lips, the mouth, the tongue, the vocal apparatus. And we've developed a brain-computer interface, or a BCI, as part of an ongoing clinical trial called BrainGate. What a BCI does is that it records Casey's brain signals as he tries to speak, and then translates those brain signals into words, so that as he tries to speak, his brain signals are recorded, decoded using artificial intelligence, to then have words appear on a screen that empowers him to speak.
How has this changed his world?
So there's a few tangible ways this has made a difference for him. First, he's gone back to work. So this is a man who's paralyzed, wheelchair-bound, and yet he's working full-time. Second, he can now have a conversation, a true conversation with a 5-year-old daughter. In other words, without having to go through intermediary, he can try to speak, have words appear on a screen, push a button, and then hear the sound of his own voice synthesized that recreate his own words as he tries to speak. Third, he no longer has to go through someone else to speak, right? So you can imagine that if the only way I can be understood by someone else is if I go through and have a translator, that is really burdensome, right? And it's very stressful to be that translator because you know that the only way that person can be understood is through you, and you're responsible for effectively advocating and understanding what that person's trying to say, and it's a huge time commitment as well. Right? So by virtue of the fact that he's now empowered to say what he wants to say, his care partners don't have to be at his bedside to do that on his behalf, and they can be freed up to take care of more mundane things or more interesting things, right? And it relieves that stress associated with it. So those are 3 tangible ways that he's made a difference. And I guess another tangible way that he's made a difference in the field is by virtue of the success that Casey's had using this brain-computer interface, there's actually been an uptick of interest with regards to company-sponsored clinical trials focusing specifically on speech restoration. So I'll name, for example, Paradromics Incorporated or Neuralink. These are 2 companies that are developing fully implanted brain-computer interfaces to restore communication to people with paralysis. And after the success that Casey's had with his system, both companies have announced that they are planning to run early feasibility studies, clinical studies that study the safety of their devices, focusing specifically on speech. And I should say, by way of conflict of interest, that I am the proposed study PI for the Paradromics clinical trial.
That's super cool. And I will make sure to post your video of this because it's an amazing, amazing story and really, really heartwarming. And you also won an award for this work, correct? Can you say a little bit about that too?
Yeah, I've been really fortunate to have been recognized by a few different awards for this work, both personally and as part of the organization. So I should talk more about that. The research consortium that I work in is something called BrainGate. So BrainGate is an academic consortium made up of a few different institutions, most notably UC Davis, Stanford, Mass General Hospital, and Emory, and that there are multiple principal investigators at each site that work together and collaboratively to kind of develop brain-computer interface technology. Each clinical trial site has a different focus, each of them dedicated towards helping people with paralysis. And so specifically the word you just mentioned, actually, Mayla, we met in Washington earlier this year because our research group at UC Davis was actually awarded the Herbert Party's Clinical Research Excellence Award, which is super cool. What that meant is that this advocacy research organization called the Clinical Research Forum, which really helps clinical research happen in America, recognized our research as the top clinical contribution to medicine in 2024. That was super cool, right? And the second thing we've actually recently awarded was the 2024 Sean Healy International Prize for Innovation in ALS. So this is a recognition from the ALS community that what we're doing matters. And so part of what I do is focus on developing next generation technologies for people with paralysis. And I've been humbled by the recognition that we've received so far, both in parts of these awards, in addition to the kind of lay media coverage we've had. When Casey went public with regards to his ability to use the brain to text system back in August of 24, we were interviewed by multiple news outlets. So most notably that come to mind, New York Times, Reuters, Scientific American, Bloomberg, NBC Universal, and so forth. So I think there's a universal recognition for the importance of this work in the sense that it's not that hard of an exercise to imagine how frustrating it would be to want to talk but can't, right? And we're taking tangible steps thanks to Casey's true contributions to the field of taking that kind of disaster scenario and coming up with solutions to help people speak for their own behalf.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing that you really are impacting the world. You being a clinical researcher really allows you to do both spaces. And I think not every scientist or researcher really gets to impact in this way. And it's pretty amazing, which is why I wanted to have you on my podcast. If people wanted to get involved in this in some way, or if they themselves are paralyzed or know somebody who's paralyzed, could they reach out to you? Or can you speak a little bit about that too?
Yeah, let's start with that second question. If you live with paralysis and be interested in contributing your time and energy to work with researchers to develop brain-computer interface technology, there's a few options for you. So one, if you're interested specifically in working with me or my extended team, you can email me, braingate@ucdavis.edu. That's BrainGate, the word brain and the word gate, G-A-T-E, @ucdavis.edu. Or more generally, you can just Google BrainGate and clinical trial, and you'll find a tremendous amount of information about how to learn more about becoming as a participant. The first part of your question is interesting because how do researchers get involved in this kind of thing? And what's nice about this particular discipline is just how multidisciplinary it is. You know, I can kind of talk about my lab as it stands. We have 3 postdocs, a full-time faculty scientist. We have 4 PhD students, 2.5 staff, and I co-direct the laboratory together with the basic scientist, Sergey Stavisky. What's unique about our setup is we have both a surgeon and a scientist running a laboratory together. Now, I should say I do have a PhD in neuroscience, but it's much easier to say a surgeon and a scientist in terms of doing this. So what that allows us to do is divide and conquer and move quickly. Right. So we've gone from starting our lab in October 2021 to having a Nature paper and a New England Journal paper talking about human translational work and having a dramatic impact in the field. And that because Sergey and I are aligned about our common vision, and we approach the problem in such a way that we can move quickly and kind of divvy up tasks because, boy, each of us could do this alone, but it would be a lot slower to do that. When I talk about the background of my postdocs, one comes from a basic neuroscience background looking at connectivity of the motor cortex in primates. One comes from the background of working in another clinical trial for BCIs based out of Chicago. And a third comes from the birdsong world, like studying invasive recordings in birds to understand how birds sing and trying to translate those principles of communication to people. My PhD students, some come from industry. We have one PhD student who worked at Amazon before coming to work with us. One worked as a startup and a software engineer, and the other two are computer science PhDs, right? So when you look historically of who's entered the field of brain-computer interfaces over the last few decades, it's clinicians like myself, a neuroscientist, neuroengineers, computer scientists, and then you have allied healthcare professionals, right? So you have speech-language pathologists and occupational therapists who have been involved in this work in the past. And then mathematicians have been involved. And what's really cool is that every background provides a different perspective as to their particular niche training, yet it all kind of comes together towards a common goal, which is helping people that are paralyzed.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So you've just talked about like all the people you're kind of influencing and how like they're also helping you. I guess can you just speak a little bit more about who has influenced you and who are people you look up to that have led you to these things to do and really have this big impact on the world?
Gosh, that's a really good question. So it took me 17 years of training from high school to get to the point where I planted my flag and said, I am an independently practicing neurosurgeon and independent PI doing scientific research. So you can imagine over those 17 years, I've met some people that have been really influential for the way that I think, and especially really influential for the way that I practice medicine. I'm a surgeon who does science. I'm not a scientist who does surgery, right? And I think that what motivates me is really the patient in front of me and wanting to do good and offer excellent and cutting-edge clinical care for the people that I meet. And in so doing, I use the problems that I see to inform the scientific questions and into a virtuous cycle, I think, of development and making the world a better place. So people have influenced me along the way. I can think about one neurosurgeon that I've met when I was still a medical student in Calgary who probably was the first person to introduce me to the idea of technological innovation in surgery and then using this kind of virtuous cycle of innovation to help patients. That was Garnnete Sutherland. This would have been back in 2008 or 2009. Really amazing work in terms of robotics and in terms of intraoperative technology that helped guide surgical therapy. He's a very interesting character and very bright man. One of my biggest mentors through my career and still is a mentor and friend is Leigh Hochberg, who is the sponsor investigator of the clinical trial for BrainGate. Leigh is more than anyone else in the world responsible for the current state of human brain-computer interface development with regards to translating animal models into first-in-human translations, into influencing the development of companies in this space to develop clinical trials for it. A remarkably intelligent, thoughtful, and kind man that influenced me. And in fact, the reason I got into BCI technology at all, kind of rewinding back to 2011, I realized when I started my surgical residency, I was interested in becoming an academic. And I wanted to build an academic laboratory and something that leveraged my background in physics and undergraduate in Vancouver. And so I started looking around at engineering conferences, and I went to IEEE EMBS conference in Boston and just started looking around. And I caught a talk done by a guy who turned out to be Leigh, which was on brain-computer interfaces on a guy with paralysis controlling a computer cursor with his mind. And this was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. And so I walked up to him and I said, Leigh, my name's David. You never met me before. This has been earth-shattering. How do I learn more about this? And Leigh was kind enough to take half an hour out of his day to buy me a coffee, give me some names, give me research directions to think about. And then 2 years later, I ended up being his PhD student, then his PhD candidate, and then his postdoc in his group, and now a site PI for his clinical trial that's investigating these devices. And so he's been another truly influential person. I would say that later on in my career, there have been doctors that I've looked up to as being paragons of clinical excellence. So I can think of two that I trained with especially that I still keep up with and I look to in terms of what professionalism means in surgery and how to take care of the patients in front of you. And I think that, Daniel McNeely and Gwynedd Pickett are two people that I keep in my heart whenever I interact with patients. And in the clinic, they're phenomenal surgeons. They're incredibly thoughtful, and they've influenced how I practice medicine more than anyone else. And then my mentor at fellowship was a guy named Bob Gross. Bob is a very senior functional neurosurgeon who was the previous president of the ASSFN, which is the American Society for Stereotactic and Functional Neurosurgery. And the way that he thinks about translating research questions into the clinic and learning from every patient that you operate on to gain insights for your next patient and be willing to push boundaries of what we can offer patients was really inspiring. And together with him and Nick Boulis, again, this willingness to try to push the boundaries, work together with industry to make reality happen, to have burning research questions to help patients in front of you, and to have a good time while you're doing it. And I think those two mentors, most recently in my career, have been really influential. And then finally, as I've started my job here at UC Davis, Shahlaie, who's the current chairman of neurosurgery, has been a tremendous inspiration for me to thinking about how to start acting as a leader and how to build consensus among many other clinicians and scientists towards a common goal with regards to helping patients. So I would say if you were to track back mentors that I've had in my career, you could track that back to medical school, to residency, to my grad school, and then finally, even as I am entering practice as a practicing neurosurgeon, I still have mentors that I look up to, and I call up and ask, hey, well, what should I do in this situation, or what would you do?
I love this question because I think it's so important who has really influenced us, and saying thank you to them. So I'll say a thank you to all of those people who has really helped you impact the world in the ways that you have said. And also, your story about Leigh reminds me of mine, too, of how I found my field at first for my PhD, where I was at a conference for mathematics, like the big mathematics conference, and I saw that there was talks about biomedicine and math. And I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. Like, this totally combines all my things. I studied pre-med, I studied math, and so I was like, whoa, like, let me go see and check this out. And that really started me off on this computational biology journey and everything else I've done so far in my career. And so conferences and networking and just hearing talks that are totally out of your comfort zone or totally out of things you know, and talking to people about that is just unreal and really pushes our careers in ways we had no idea happen. And even true of my current career in team science, just by happenstance, I met people in that field, and I didn't even know that field existed until recently. And it's just amazing how people can really influence our careers for the best possible ways. So I'll just say thank you to all of them for you as well.
Yeah, and mentorship is important, and I try to do my best to pay it forward. So as you can imagine, I'm a fairly busy schedule, but I generally go out of my way to at least meet for 20 minutes whenever I have a future clinician scientist that wants to talk about career trajectory development. It's so important to be able to pay forward the kinds of mentorship that I experienced through my very long academic path.
And I'll say thank you for the time then, for giving me potentially an entire hour to talk to you. And I'm not even a clinician scientist myself, but I'll go to our next question. How do you know if you've been successful at your work and as a researcher? What is your evaluation criteria?
Good. I think about this often, and I think that the ability to get feedback of your performance is really important when you practice medicine. Maybe I'll just go on a soapbox and talk about a different question that you didn't ask and bring it back to the question you just did. And that is, burnout happens in medicine when the consequences of your actions can't inform what happens next, right? So when you look at situations where what you do, you don't see the impact of, you're much more likely to burn out because the consequences of your actions don't matter as much unless they're just legal. Or number two, you can't learn from your mistakes when they do happen. And I think as a surgeon, I have a privilege of seeing the immediate impact of the decisions that I make, and I get feedback either in the operating room or very shortly after that operation. And so that kind of closed loop cycle of performing an action, understanding the impact of that action, and then allowing that to then do better for the next patient is something that's very tangible to surgeons. And so to that end, how do you know you've won as a translational scientist, translational neurotechnology specialist, right? If my goal is to help people with paralysis communicate, how do I know when I'm succeeding? And I think there's a few ways to answer that. One is the guy can talk. So we develop a device to restore communication. He starts to use it, and he wants to use it. That's a win. And the corollary of that is that I communicate that to expert scientists through blinded peer review, and they say, yep, this is a good idea, and yep, the science checks out. Second, I know I've won because there's a tangible impact of the work that I do with regards to helping patients. And that's what I was talking about earlier with regards to having companies that have looked at our work and have changed their mission statement based on the feasibility of being able to demonstrate communication restoration in this one guy. And third, I know I've won when my students succeed, right? So as a mentor, I have postdocs and PhDs, and by virtue of having provided training and environment for success, they have gone through and learned new things about how the human brain works, communicated these findings, and move on to their next opportunities that kind of come and ways to advance their career, whether that's industry or academia or otherwise.
Students come up a lot as a big evaluation criteria, which is a very academic thing to say. It's very cool that you can really see your impact, and this idea of burnout is a fascinating idea to me to think about. Like, that's when burnout happens, when you can't really see that impact or learn the lessons from it. And I'll have to think more on that in general.
Yeah, there's an entire field of burnout. So people think about this very deeply, the clinical psychology of like, what are the factors that set you up for failure? And one of it has to do with the lack of control. I'm not an expert in this, so that's my caveat. But I have spent a great deal of time thinking about it because I work a lot. I'm interested in making sure that I mitigate factors that go towards burnout. So one of them is not being able to control your environment, right? The second thing is not seeing the consequences of your actions. And the third thing is not enjoying what you're doing. If any of those three factors are not there, then you start setting yourself up for burnout. There's other factors like how much you're working, how much work-life balance, how much money you make, et cetera, et cetera. But my understanding of this literature is that there are factors that are recognized for this. And I think surgeons, especially clinicians, scientists, surgeons, check a lot of those boxes that are anti-burnout with regards to what you're working with and knowing the consequences of your actions matter and you get real-time feedback of what you're doing. I'm very privileged to be in that position. Not everyone is.
Yeah, and it's awesome. And this feedback loop is just amazing. So with that, what has been your most surprising result?
The two ways I can answer that. I'll answer that scientifically, and then I'll answer that for the person I'm working with. Okay. Scientifically, it turns out that this part of the brain is really complicated. We are recording from the ventral precentral gyrus, or the part of the brain that helps coordinate movements of the face, the tongue, the larynx, and so forth. And it turns out beyond doing that, it does a whole host of other things that we've discovered with our participant, Casey. So for example, not only does it control these movements, but it also encodes semantic information with regards to language. Not only does it help with coordination of movements, it also encodes error information. In other words, I know that the decoder made an error, and I can register not only that an error occurred, but what kind of an error that decoder was, whether it's a nonsense error, a homophone, a synonym, and so forth. Not only does this part of the brain control movements of the face, but it also controls arm movements or hand movements, or directionality of movements that Casey's been able to use to control his computer using a computer cursor. Not only does it control this information with regards to movement, but it also does information with regards to what he's hearing, or information with regards to what he's feeling. And not only does it do the face, but it also does his arms and his legs. So, okay, scientifically, all of those are really interesting questions because they wouldn't be predicted based on what we knew about how the human brain worked up to Casey's involvement in the clinical trial. Okay. First. Second, what else have I learned about this? There's the human aspect of this, right? So as a clinician, I see people that are paralyzed all the time, but it didn't hit home about what the burden was, and I say the word burden deliberately, on a care partner to have to translate on someone's behalf, right? So if you have to be there in order to have your loved one communicate, that's a lot of pressure, and that's a lot of time. And that's a lot of time that you are spending not doing other things like helping to maintain a house, or working, or having your own downtime. And that is a lot of pressure because the only way that person can be understood is through you. And you're essentially having to act as a translator without paraphrasing too much of what someone is trying to say. And boy, that's a lot. And that really didn't hit home to me until I actually saw how the brain-computer interface was able to empower Casey to say what he wanted to say.
Yeah, I love this question because I think this is really how we push science and get to our new questions. I don't think it's the only way, but some of these surprises that we totally don't expect get us really excited to ask new questions and learn new information. And so it's one of my favorite questions to ask, and I really hope you're able to start to answer some of these questions of what does it mean when all these other functions relate to this brain part at large, and maybe that can help with other types of functionality for these people, which is pretty amazing to think about and not even possible to have thought about before this happened, which is, I think, even the cooler part of it at large. Kind of the other side of this coin is What is your favorite disagreement?
So rather than directly answer your question, I'll say, what are the greatest unknowns? And I'll say, of the things that I have learned, I outlined about 5 or 6 different scientific innovations that came from recording this part of the brain. We understand that we can use them. We don't understand why we see the things that we do. And we don't understand the full implications of how the brain works to be able to create these findings. And I think it's really exciting to know that with our participants and future participants as part of these clinical trials, we'll be really to dive into these questions, unlock more about how the human brain works, and hopefully provide tangible solutions for future people living with paralysis.
So you've never had any disagreements about your work?
Okay. No, of course we have. As I said, I run a laboratory together with a basic scientist. And what I like to tell people is that Sergey and I are aligned for 90% of things, and we disagree on about 10% of things, right? For example, I know a lot about computer programming for a neurosurgeon and used to code things up for fun. And Sergey cares a lot more with regards to scientific underpinnings of brain function. And without going into too much details, there is a way of thinking about the brain as a dynamical system, which is a way to articulate and explain a lot of brain functions and brain findings that we've accumulated over the last few decades. And I am personally less interested in that because it may not always be directly translatable to an outcome. And he is personally less interested in software design and software engineering. And so these are kinds of disagreements we have internally in terms of prioritization of resources to be able to meet towards the common goal that we do agree upon, which is helping a guy talk. And so, I think there's certainly disagreements in the field of how a lot of things manifest, but there are so few people out there that have these devices implanted that allow us the ability to learn about how the human brain works. These disagreements we're talking about are small ends, and so it's a very different story than working in a broader research environment where multiple laboratories that are attacking this problem from multiple angles. I'm not trying to dodge the question. I'm just trying to say, look, I think that is actually a very hard question to answer.
And no, I hear you, and I encourage more researchers to do this and more people to get on board with this in whatever way. So however I can help with that, right, through this podcast, please post it in whatever place you can. Because I want this to continue, and I want there to be disagreements, right? I think disagreements ideally push us forward. So can you speak to, even with these interpersonal disagreements of how to attack a system or do the research, right, that you're currently doing, how does that move you forward in some way? And how does it really actually help you, right, to have even these disagreements at large?
Yeah, I think it helps with prioritization, right? You have limited resources. You have limited funds. We live in an environment where much of the foundational work that has been done to get the field to where it is right now has come through publicly funded grants, right? Through mechanisms of the NIH and other kinds of public organizations that are taxpayer funded. NIH, National Institute of Health, among, like the National Science Foundation, and so other kinds of national level, large organizations in America that are really focused on pushing science forward. The field of BCI is particularly a great example where basic science innovation in animal models for decades, which were publicly funded, led to publicly funded clinical trials that demonstrated the feasibility of these, which led to companies that are solving these kinds of problems, right? So there's a beautiful translation from why questions to how questions to, all right, let's do something about it questions that really companies are the best positioned to be able to address, okay? So if you have limited resources and limited time, how do you prioritize, right? And the answer is, well, you prioritize based on what your goals are. You always have a North Star of what you're trying to do, and you work backwards and answer what are the right ways to go about heading towards your North Star. Here I use North Star as the way that I was introduced to by a gentleman named Eric Leuthardt at WashU when he came to visit UC Davis, as having a guiding principle that kind of helps you stay focused in how you spend your time and energy. And these kinds of disagreements are really helpful because it helps you prioritize and have an opportunity to discuss the pros and cons of approaching different things where you're always heading towards your North Star. It's just that, you may go left as opposed to right before you go straight.
I agree. No path is actually straight. We all go different directions to really get to that. But this idea of really having a North Star or a guiding principle or a shared goal or a shared vision, as we talk about in team science, is so important to get us there and to help us prioritize. So you talked about a little bit about grants. If you could do anything, not limited by grants or other factors in your space, what would you be doing? What is your vision for the work?
So I'm fortunate, and that is if I won the lottery tomorrow, like if I had enough money, never have to work again, paying off mortgages, etc., what I would do is I would pay off my mortgage. I'd probably buy a nice car. I'd take a vacation. And I would come back and do what I'm doing, except work less. Rather than working 60 to 80 hours a week, I would try to aim to work 40 to 60 hours a week. I would still have my clinical practice. I would still do my research and probably just do less trauma call. But otherwise, I would do exactly what I'm doing, right, in terms of helping to move this technology forward, doing clinical trial leadership, and helping patients with epilepsy and Parkinson's disease. I'm lucky that way, but I probably would schedule more vacations for myself.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing to love what you do, and that you can just say, I'm actually doing it. So that's amazing to hear, and that, no, there's not many limitations that are making that feasible, except for maybe time and resources a little bit.
I'll be frank, I haven't enjoyed the entire pathway to get here. Certainly, if you've ever talked to medical doctors before and you've talked to doctors that have done a residency, especially a surgical residency, it's not a walk in the park, right? You know, when I was a chief resident in Eastern Canada, Dalhousie, I worked between 60 and 128 hours a week. And so that's a lot of work, right? And this happened before they had work hour restrictions in terms of my training. But be that as it may, would I want to repeat that part of my life? No. Am I glad I did it? Yes. And certainly it's a different conversation to talk about work hour restrictions for training physicians, the right way to do this, call, handover, and so forth. That's in a completely different podcast. But certainly getting to where I am right now, it made a lot of the sacrifices and hard work and time that I put into making this a reality. I'll give an example of that. So I met my wife when I was in grad school in Rhode Island. And then after finishing, before returning back to Halifax, we got engaged, so I put a ring on it. And then I changed countries, and we lived apart for 2.5 years. And we kept up a relationship by visiting each other. I would fly down for a weekend when I had weekends off, and she'd fly up to Canada for a week at a time. And I remember one time she came to stay with me. I think it was like a Thursday through a Thursday. And we spent 10 hours together over that course of a week, right? Actually in-person time because of sneaky operations that came on or just the intensity of the work that I was doing. I married the right woman. She can put up with this, and she's fiercely independent, and she's very supportive of my career. I could not have done this, and I could not have been as successful as I am without Sarah supporting me through this entire process.
I'll say thank you to Sarah also for doing that and everything, and just the support of our families and friends is just unreal in all of this. And so maybe is part of your vision thinking about how you would change the education system maybe in terms of this. Maybe you don't have ideas yet, but
yeah, I got to say what we experience now in 2025 is way better than what we experienced in 2015, which is way better than what we experienced in 95 and 85 and so forth, right? I think that there's a recognition of the humanity of clinicians as they practice medicine, but I think there's a recognition, too, that it's a hard problem. And you just need repetitions of seeing cases and seeing complications to be able to learn from your mentors and move into independent practice. And the reality is you just need to spend time doing it. And surgery especially is a mechanical skill. It's a cognitive skill. And you need the exposure of doing operations to be able to practice independently. Would you want the surgeon who did 500 cases in the part of the training or did 2,000 cases as part of their training? Just you personally, what would you want for your parents? You probably want the latter. And so the question is, how do you get those 2,000 operations or whatever the number is as part of your training? And the answer is you put in the hours. But the question is, how do you do that humanely? As I said earlier, it took me 17 years to get through training, but that's because I went through a 3-year medical school and didn't finish college. And I went and trained in Canada, which is a 6-year residency program, and I finished my PhD in 3 years and 10 months. So how do you do that faster? Well, the answer is it's tough. And how do you actually maintain your humanity during that training process? And the answer is it's tough. There's literature that's looked at this in terms of humanizing the training process, and there are no easy answers.
Yeah, I'll just say that I don't necessarily think it needs to be faster, that it could take more time. I think it's this humaneness to it, and
yeah.
I'm glad people are studying this.
Let's rewind, though. You're 18 years old, and you hear this podcast of this Brandman guy going on talking about restoring speech, and you said, wow, that's cool. I want to do that. And you start running through the numbers, and then you get to the point where it'll take 25 years to do that. The idea of committing 25 years of your life to do that outside of joining the Russian army in the 19th century is not something that you'd really think about doing, right? Frankly, I think that it's tough, right? And I think it's nuanced in terms of thinking about time commitments involved in this kind of thing and choosing your pathway through academic medicine.
Yeah, and hopefully in the future it will continue to be researched. And thank you for all your training to be able to get here at large. With that, I'll ask you to outroduce yourself with your job title and fields, and please say your name and anything else you'd like to say.
Sure. I'm David Brandman. I'm a neurosurgeon at UC Davis. My clinical practice specializes in helping people with Parkinson's disease, epilepsy, chronic pain, and spasticity. In other words, I'm a functional stereotactic neurosurgeon. And I also co-direct the UC Davis Neuroprosthetics Lab. So our group focuses on developing next-generation technologies to help people with neurological disorders. And the capstone project of our group is the development of a brain-computer interface, or a BCI. A brain-computer interface is a device that records brain signals from people that are paralyzed and then translates those brain signals to allow people to control objects in their environment. So our group recently reported in the New England Journal of Medicine that a 46-year-old man with ALS could try to speak, and as he tried to speak, words appeared on a screen. We can decode what he wants to say with about 99% accuracy out of a vocabulary of 125,000 words. And just yesterday, we had a paper released in Nature that demonstrated that not only could we translate his brain signals into text, but we could actually recreate a digital voice box so that as he tries to speak, he can hear the sound of his own voice, he can sing, create interjections, and create nonsense words and so forth. And so that is the research aspect of what I do. That's the clinical aspect of what I do. And I also do clinical trial leadership, where I'm the site PI for the BrainGate clinical trial at UC Davis. So BrainGate is a clinical trial that's studying the safety profile of chronically implanted electrodes in people with paralysis, of which Casey, the gentleman I was just referring to, is enrolled into. And I'm also the proposed study PI for the Paradromics clinical trial that will be studying the safety profile of a chronically implanted, fully implanted system designed to restore communication for people with paralysis. I think I'm lucky to be able to speak multiple languages. I speak doctor, I speak computer science, I speak neuroscience, and I speak allied healthcare professional up to a point. And these are things that I can act as a translator. And being able to speak multiple languages allows you to be creative because it allows you to look as to what is different than it was done before. So maybe rather than saying, I don't like to be boxed, I would say, I want to collect as many boxes as I can to understand how to combine them to build new sculptures.
My biggest takeaway is that conferences, networking, and talking to people can lead us down incredible paths that we didn't know existed. Listening to things and people outside our comfort zone can push us in so many ways we don't expect. What new space or people have you been curious to learn about? Where can you go, or who can you talk to learn more? This podcast is hosted by me, Mayla Boguslav, and produced and edited by Joshua Mendel. To learn more about this episode's guest and any cited or named people, take a look at the episode description. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Ignorance Podcast. Please follow the Ignorance Podcast wherever you get your podcasts to learn about science through research questions.